Virginia, Dr. Adam Banks, assistant professor of graduate school education at Stanford University, and Dr. Douglas Wade Brunton, assistant professor of library of Department of Literary, Cultural, and Communication Studies. And on this panel, they're sort of going to discuss what it means to sort of prioritize the joyful moments when so much of social media is really looking at death and trauma and oppression. So with that, I'll turn it over to our wonderful panelists for this brilliant conversation.
All right. Let's see, can everyone hear me? Thank you, Zakia. Thank you all so much, organizers of Archiving the Black Web. We are all thrilled to be here and of course, just jubilant over the fact that we get to talk about Black joy. So we are very much looking forward to having this discussion with you, co-kicking it about some of our favorite moments within web history as far as Black folks go. Dr. Banks, Dr. Wade Brunton, how y'all feeling?
Pretty good, and I'm really happy to be here. I like to take the opportunity to tell everyone thank you. It's sort of weird for me to be having this conversation because I'm maybe the only Caribbean voice here, but I think it's great that I've been given the voice and that we have the opportunity to talk about how joy can be expressed globally through the digital.
And I'm just thrilled at the overall conference lineup, the design, the way it was put together. Big love to Makiba Burgess, all the project partners, and obviously to be in conversation with you two. So yeah, I'm hyped on a Friday.
So let's get down to it. One thing I want to ask to sort of frame this conversation has to do with memory. So we're talking about what it means to archive the Black web, what it means to preserve our experiences for ourselves, not just for the record, but for making sure that we have a collection of experiences that haven't been extracted from our communities, but that have been collaboratively constructed. Mm-hmm. And on that, as I've been teaching about archival work and memory work in the last year, one of the things that has come up for my students is this concept of flashbulb memory. Mm-hmm. And flashbulb memory being, you know, the moment that is imprinted in your mind when there is a cultural event that happens that we all know about, we all have some connection to. And so I want to kind of give y'all a little quiz and ask you something just to illustrate this point. Now, it may not go the way I think it's going to go, but we're going to try it. Do either of you remember where you were or what you were doing when you first heard about what was going down in Ferguson when Mike Brown was killed?
Yeah. I knew exactly where I was and I knew exactly what I was doing. Michael Brown's unfortunate death happened 2 weeks before I moved to the United States to start my PhD. Mm-hmm. And it caused a lot of consternation on my part because I had not had a lot of experience in the United States at that point. I was moving to the US for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And for the first time in my life, I began to know my race became a very important part of the way that I perceived myself. So yeah, that was a very signal moment for me.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Banks, how about you? Do you remember where you were?
I remember vividly for a lot of reasons, but so I was at University of Kentucky at the time, and it was my practice every Thursday or Friday afternoon to get out by making the drive to Cleveland. And I happened to do that on some other days as well. And so I happened to be in Cleveland. Don't get me wrong, the Black folks I had community with in Kentucky, I loved them and missed them. But I was very glad I was not physically in that place at that time. And so I was feeling both kind of bombarded with yet another one of these murders, and feeling like at least I could be in community with some of my folk as it was going down.
Okay. So then I want to ask you about a different moment. Do you remember where you were when you heard about Rachel Dolezal and how she was being resoundingly mocked online?
I don't remember the initial moment, but I remember waves of hilarity as Black Twitter weighed in on it. There were multiple days of serious conversation, think piece like kinds of conversation, and just the everyday Twitter doing what Twitter do.
Dr. Wade Brunton, do you remember, I'm gonna make it specific to the Caribbean and Caribbean culture for you. Do you remember when you first started seeing those memes that have a word that I won't say in this space because I know it's not polite conversation, from patois, Jamaican patois, that people would put an explanation, they'd mock it up with a meme, and none of the memes addressed what that word actually meant?
I think that's almost, I hesitate to use the word native, but I think that expression is, that use of memetics is native to the Caribbean space. Mm-hmm. We are a very image-driven people. Mm-hmm. And one of my informants in the work that I've been doing, one of the people that I've been talking to says that you can weigh in on how heavy an incident is by how fast the memes are created. So if it takes 2 days for the memes to appear, it means that people have taken the time, digested, and are in fact resisting what has happened. Mm-hmm. If they're instant response, it means that people aren't really taking what has happened seriously, mm-hmm. and are just reacting in the moment. So the word, the use of memetics in the Caribbean, particularly in the Caribbean internet, I think become an archive in and of themselves, because the memetics mark the occasion, the importance of the occasion. Mm-hmm.
Right, right. So I asked this question and I pose it to folks who are watching, 188 participants. I ask you to think about these moments in juxtaposition. The flashbulb memory that is created from Black pain, Black suffering, Black death, versus the flashbulb memory, or perhaps lack thereof, created around iterances of Black joy. Like, we remember in passing, and we remember the affective experience, and we remember what it was like to be engaged with our community around iterances of joy, but they don't quite strike us in the same way that those memories of pain do. And I think it's really important that we direct our attention to what it means for us to play, to have joy, to express jouissance, to call up Andre Brock here, right? To just engage in the ratchet and the real and have a really good time, and what it means for us to preserve those memories. To me, it stands out as really interesting and compelling because we're not necessarily stamping those memories with the same kind of, I want to talk about committing to the record, and words are failing me here, but they just don't hold up in the same way. And I wonder about why that is. Is it because we are living through that joy and we carry it with us all the time? Or is it because perhaps we take it for granted? So I wanted to know about how you think about the way that we hold on to Black joy, how we preserve it, and ultimately how we archive it.
Let me follow you on this, Professor Wade Brunton.
Oh, great. I think Black joy is unique to people who, or Black joy is new to people who are not Black. So I do think that Black joy is a state of being for all of us. Mm-hmm. You know, there are moments in time, there are moments, even with the burden of carrying the identity, the marked identity, there are moments in everyday occurrence where joy is natural. Mm-hmm. You know, And I think that what we do with Black joy more significantly than Black sorrow is that Black joy becomes a community effort. In the sense that, you know, someone will create a hashtag, someone will share a picture, people will pile on. Dr. Banks goes on about butter pecan ice cream online.
Weekly.
You know, and that Black joy, I think that expression of joy is a way of sharing joy with the community and letting the community build on its own joy as part of that experience. Whereas the more often shared experiences of Black pain and Black suffering, those are not necessarily shared to build community, but to demonstrate the experience of Blackness in the space that Blackness has been experienced. You know, so this is the experience here. And I suspect, you know, when I share this, that you will have something that is cogent to this experience. Whereas Black joy is, hey, you know, we're having a good time, pile on.
And so I'd like to work with your question a little bit. So I want to try to work at it from a couple of different angles. So in terms of flashbulbing moments of Black joy, there are a few that I can mention that many of you on the call and probably both of you might ping as well. So I can tell you exactly what I was doing when Temecula hit on Black Twitter. I could tell you exactly what I was doing when the Zola story dropped.
Yes, yes.
Right. And then with some of the moments that I write about as how Black folk kind of recreate the family reunion on Twitter around some kinds of social watching, whether it's the award shows or other moments where we just kind of collectively decide. Now, to some degree, that's sort of stamped for us, you know, by the moment when that event happened. But so aside from some of those types of moments, the thing that I'd like to add that I really wonder your thoughts about, Dr. Clark, I think some of that flash bulbing or time stamping happens in the joy that we take in referencing some of the past moments. In other words, there's in some of the wordplay or the image play with memes and GIFs or other forms of participating, you know, if we can go back to Vine and we can go back to other forms, but the references act as a kind of rememory, you know, for those who get the reference of what, you know, is being called back. So I'll give you one example of a conversation topic that simultaneously gets on people's nerves and re-sparks a lot of the kind of hilarity that can ensue. As soon as I say $200 dates,
it's on.
right? And so there will be whole other conversations and somebody will bring that back in. Here we go, this is just like. And so there's a kind of vernacular practice of memory stamping, if not, you know, time stamping or flash bulbing these moments, I think. And so I wonder if you would agree.
I definitely would. And I don't discount what happens in terms of affect and what that means, and how, honestly, thinking about us being people who are tied to a totally different set of cultural norms, where time in and of itself, that's not really our construct. You know, we move forward and backward through this thing that we call time. And so when I think about something as like flashbulb memory, I really think about what has been imposed on us rather than the expressions of who we are and how we are, right? And so I think about not necessarily joy being something that we think about in terms of a moment, but joy being this feeling that we carry with us all the time, that we draw from in the moments when we really need it, that we just lay back in and enjoy when we have a moment to relax, to kick it. And I continue to think about that as resistance as well. You know, Black joy being resistance. One of my friends, Dr. Jamita Barlow, talks about what it means to resist being Black and simply showing up for life and choosing to laugh this day and choosing to have fun, you know, choosing to get in and start dancing, doing the wobble, whatever it is, what line dance we're doing that year when it plays out on the street. And that's exactly what I think of in this digital space. And what challenges me about that in particular, I'm facing this challenge right now as I'm bringing this book on Black Twitter to a close. What challenges me is, how do you archive something like that? Something that isn't defined by linearity,
Right.
something that isn't defined by the imposition of how do we categorize this? You know, how exactly do we, is it comedy? Is it satire? Is it play? How do we describe these things? And I think that's a big challenge. And one, I wonder if we could each talk about how we approach making records of this joy and preserving them and adding them to the historical record of our experiences that we want to live on long after the platforms and the people are gone.
I love the question, because what happens in our digital lives is so ephemeral, right? You know, and because we've got a pretty long period of time that we're looking at, you know, we're talking about almost 22 years since Black Planet hit. You know, my first experiences were in some of the other chats before Black Planet, like Talk City and Net Noir and some of the others. And so across that time, you know, if we think about all of the spaces that we've occupied, if we think about everything that's happened there that we've lost in terms of, you know, despite the Wayback Machine and whatever else, we can't quite capture in the same way. I've actually been thinking about this. And so if we were to ask, and so going back to the prompt, where does the joy reside? And I love that in the session description. One thing I would offer as a response. So if we're thinking of, let's just say the 22 years since Black Planet hit, and all of these you know, Ning, group chats, Black Twitter, Instagram, you know, people who are on Friendster, you know, people who are on Flickr before Instagram, right? And we can chart all of that. But capturing the joy, or where the joy resides for me, is as much in the practices we bring as it is in the content that made any one particular post or one particular evening funny. Right. So let me give you a quick example, because I think this fits both your flashbulb question and the sort of duality of snatching joy out of the trauma and joy as resistance. The N-word Navy moment.
It was coming. Right? You knew it was coming.
So we can point to all kinds of individual posts that were hilarious. But what is it about community in that moment, right? So one practice, you know, is that, especially in our digital lives where we're scattered and might have different kinds of multiple or frayed connections to each other, the idea that, especially Twitter, but these other places, we will joke about anything. It does not matter. That irreverence, that resistance to what maybe some others might think is appropriate or fitting in the conversation, that practice is a big part of what makes these communal moments happen. Because, you know, as soon as that hit, some of us knew, oh, we about to be here a while, right? And so, like, I'll yield, you know, because there are multiple, you know, more of us here, but identifying some of those practices that can be charted over time, you know, without feeling like we've got to capture every individual moment that might have been useful or relevant. I think that's one way we can deal with the fleeting nature of the media that we're in.
I like what Dr. Banks has said, and I wanted to address the question directly. Where does the joy reside? And for me, I think where the joy resides is in the third spaces of our own making.
Let's
right?
go.
Lefebvre says that there are three ways that we experience the world as we know it, the world as we experience it, and the world as we wish it. The world as we wish it is where the joy resides in our online expressions. Black Twitter, for example, is a perfect space for this type of conversation. The joy, Black people have made Black Twitter what it is. It is a space for Black people to be Black. It is a space for Black people to share in-jokes. And that type of community is, while the interactions are ephemeral, the community, the joy resides there every time we go there.
Listen.
So
Yeah,
that,
and I just think we need to underscore part of what you just said there, Doc, because the fact that we come to these spaces and Black Twitter is an exemplar, boldly, irreverently, wildly being our fullest selves in the sense of the classic Langston Hughes essay, Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain, with all of the surveillance, right? With all of the public attention, with the fact that we know the streets are watching, with the fact that we know that corporations might, lift or borrow or appropriate some elements of what they think is happening there. That's where the joy is real resistance, right? And, I might say some things later about why I think that's an example of how a funk aesthetic or a funk trope can help us provide a lens for actually grasping some of what's happening there. So you just laid out a really important point I wanted to kind of underscore there.
Thank you.
I'm curious about this funk expression for sure. I do want to encourage people who are watching, and I see all of you all typing in the chat, so I know that you're there. Folks who have this going at home who want to contribute, it doesn't have to be a question. This is a space where we can do things where we pretend they're questions, and we all know that they're not. But if you want to make a statement and just drop it in, we would love to be able to be in conversation with you. You all know it's a little bit weird to be looking at a screen full of faces and not actually have conversation with them.
Call and response is one of those practices, right? So that's right.
It's what we do. It's what we do. I think so much, I was listening, Adam, to what you were saying about how we have carried this joy from space to space. And it reminds me so much of how we've done that, not only in these mediated spaces, but just over time through our lives, right? And that what we are seeing created, and it's one of the things that I really want researchers, especially those outside of our communities and media professionals, particularly those outside of our communities, to remember when they do work within and around our communities and on our communities, as they often do. And that is what we are doing, just like the title of this session says, we're not new to this. This is what we do. We play, we have fun, and we have done that in so many different forms. And what we're seeing in the digital is just play with the form, not only with one another, but we are playing with the technologies and subverting them and using them in ways that perhaps weren't intentioned. There's something that comes to mind when I think about this play, and it's something I want to lay down here. I've got the document called up. Every time I see, particularly Black Twitter, because that's where I'm trying to find my joy in online spaces, that in the live group text, is I think about characteristics of Negro expression from Zora Neale Hurston. And so this writing after the turn of the 20th century, long before we talk about the digital, how she lays out so perfectly exactly what it is that Black people do when we engage each other in play. And she says, every phase of Negro life is highly dramatized. No matter how joyful or how sad the case, there is sufficient poise for drama. Everything is acted out, unconsciously for the most part, of course. There is an impromptu ceremony always ready for every hour of life. No little moment passes unadorned.
Mhm.
And I love this because of how it makes us think about what is special about what we do. And I wanted to ask each of you if you could talk about a moment that was pretty, mundane to most folks, or perhaps to folks outside of our communities, that really illustrates this this theoretical framework, if you will, right? She's talking about how this is how Black folks act, this is how we do, this is how we handle life, that no moment passes unadorned. What was one of those somewhat sublime yet unadorned moments for you in some of the work that you've done?
So first of all, I'm so glad that you used Hurston to frame this question. Hurston and people like Daryl Cumber Dance, the folklorists, they're a huge reason why I take a vernacular approach to studying Black rhetorical traditions. And so, even Dr. Dance, years and years ago, she was talking about what we do with some of those email chains. This was in the pre-graphical user interface days of the internet. She talked about those email jokes in chains as Black folklore. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that provides a crucial link to these digital lives that we're living, and understanding that we can see some of what's happening in our digital lives as folklore too, and or connected to some of the tropes and the concepts that we get from Black folklore, right? So we got some tricksters online and stuff like that. But to actually answer your question, let me use this moment to acknowledge my pastor at the Church of the Music Sermon.
Yes.
Naima Cochran. And I'm so happy that I was able to see that thing become a thing in the early days, because, so what I want to highlight for this group in terms of Black Joy and in archiving the Black web, she not only curated content in really compelling ways, but curated community. And so that's where sort of what we might see as the everyday or the quotidian just really moving and tickling me. So her brilliance and the congregation.
And is Naima still doing the music sermon? I don't feel like I've seen one in a while. So talking about
there's
archives.
Sort of pop-ups now. She even mentioned about a week ago that she might do a devotional on some of the singers because she's doing other projects, but she still stays close to the music sermon. Side note for all of the information specialists here, the copyright police do a lot to hinder what's possible. And we need I don't have the answer to this question, but we need our individual and collective answers to how we're going to deal with those restrictions. Because even though she was sharing these video clips for non-commercial purposes and with attribution, the takedowns constantly came after her, right. Even though she had a brilliant project that could have extended the lives of a lot of the people that she was playing.
For me, the most mundane thing was understanding how language affected practice. Mm-hmm. So in Trinidad, we have the saying "just now." In Puerto Rico, it becomes ahorita. In Jamaica, it's soon come. Mm-hmm. And I am certain that African American vernacular English has a phrase like that. But it was this relationship to the continuous present, the vernacular language, linking that continuous present of the vernacular language to what was going on in online spaces it sort of broke everything open for me. Mm-hmm. Because Meredith, you spoke about our relationship to time, right? This continuous present that is reflected in things like just now, soon come. Mm-hmm. There's an optimism that says, regardless of what happens, I'll be back. There's an inherent optimism in a future that is in that language. And once I understood that, I'm not a linguist, but once I understood that and putting that into relationship with our practices, it just blew everything open for me.
I love that.
Yeah, I want to sit with that for a moment, that the inherent, the faith that the future is coming and I'm going to be there. That's something. Wow, thank you. Thank you.
Habitual B fits in that too, right? You were talking about these connections. Yep.
Exactly.
Finna.
Yeah.
I see that we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box here. We've got one from Leonette Louis-Jacques, who says, I have a question about surveillance of and theft of joy, which I've noticed on Twitter. So there's some coded language used and attempts to decode and explain the language. How does archiving capture both the language and the decoding? So thinking about those times where we're engaging in acts of Black joy and we're using the language that is very specific, right? It's in-group language to us. And then it shows up in BuzzFeed articles.
Right.
Or it shows up, we hear it among hip white kids in the suburbs who don't actually talk to Black people when they pass them on the street. What do we make about archiving and archiving's potential to both, collect that language as it's used and collect the decoding that we use to talk about our experiences? Let me give an example. I see it. It's sitting there. Let's see.
Well, yeah, I was deferring to Doc there for a minute too, but I'll make an attempt at it. So this is one reason I'm going to be Allen Iverson. We're talking about practice, right? So what are some of the practices that come with that language use? What's happening inside that language use? And so some of what we know that masking and muting, is a distinct Black discourse practice, as we get from Geneva Smitherman in several places. And we also know that boasting, toasting, laughing, lying, and signifying the hyperbolic is a practice that we revel in, in our online and offline lives. And so Meredith, when you talk about how Black Twitter operates with people discussing content with a Black frame of reference or a point of view, part of that point of view or frame of reference is in these practices. And so along with that, the idea of play, or if we're going to use the trope of game, having game, that the language game is always at work. And any one thing that might be stolen, like on Fleek, infamously, will never capture what's up under that made it a thing, right? And so attention to the practices can help us point out that difference, including the fact that, we often are in these spaces eager, back to Dr. G, as she says, signification is a blank's occupation, and so making sure that we're kind of getting at some of that across time, along with the kinds of borrowing, appropriation, theft that happen too. So I was quiet in the beginning because I was waiting on Doc. I gotta defer to greatness.
I was doing the same, and I'm still a little bit lost for words with the question. So, I'll give it back and sit with it just a little bit longer, please.
Sure, certainly. I actually am going to draw up this example that Leonette put in the chat for us. She says, for example, there was a Twitter conversation about the use of YT, the letters YT, and we're not talking about YouTube, right? Folks who didn't know what it meant asked, and some people were saying, don't give away the meaning. So in archiving, do we do this decoding, where we are obviously using language that is very specific to us and our communities? When we are developing archives, creating archives, doing the work of categorization and assigning meaning to what we are trying to preserve, do we do that decoding as well?
That's so from that side of the question, audience really matters, right? But I would suggest that there's good justification for not doing that decoding at least some of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so with the YT, right? We got all these other spellings of it too.
2420.
Right. DW, IGT. So from the libraries or the museums or the archives perspective, if you serve a primarily Black audience, that would probably, take the question in some directions. If you serve a very cultural, multi-ethnic audience, I'm leaning toward protecting times where that doesn't happen. The reason I'm hesitant, in a world that has Urban Dictionary that is probably going to get the references or the uses of these terms
very wrong.
Right.
Very wrong.
So yeah, that one's a challenge.
I'm going to lean to not doing the decoding.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important that you're true to the voice that you're recording in the first instance. And then I think as the researcher, giving someone raw data to work with, I think is also significantly important over time. Let them make sense of it, because there is going to be a gap between my record of the archive and your use of the archive.
Mm-hmm.
And in that time, anything can happen. Interpretation, social change, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there needs to be the opportunity for people to bring their lived experience to the interpretation of the archive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We can present guidelines. I mean, context is everything in this type of, if you are giving an accurate record, there is some type of context. And then I think that one is then put on the researcher to do the interpretation based on their own lived experience to make sense of what is going on in that moment.
I love our mixtape museum founders comment in the chat. Summer McCoy, big love to you for the work you do. IYKYK.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we have this question in the Q&A, and Dr. Conley, I see your question. I'm gonna come back to it in a second. We have a question from Frazine Taylor. She mentions, or they mention rather, excuse me, what about slave narratives? Sometimes if they were not decoded, the meaning wouldn't come across. So when we think about some of the problems of not doing that decoding, what might be lost to future generations?
So one way through this particular tension, I'm not saying it is the answer, right? But so documenting, the data, the information that an archivist might have for their work isn't always going to be what hits the exhibit, right? And so documenting it in real time could still support an approach to the archive that has the call and response, the room for the interaction, and the lived experience that Doc suggested. And then over time, where context requires more setup, or if others are kind of working on translating to pick up what time can take, having that in the originary moment can be useful at that later time. These great questions are making me want to go do an IST degree, though. I want to think about these over the long haul. Maybe I need to be working in a library instead of a university. I don't know.
Dr. Brunton?
I think one way of countering the slave, or providing another way of looking at the slave narratives, is building our own archives.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the Caribbean, there's the Caribbean Memory Project, where people are invited to turn in pictures of their relations and tell the story of that person. Okay? Now, the Caribbean is slightly different to the US context in the way that race is constructed, not necessarily the way race is experienced, but the way that race is constructed, right? So there are a number of Caribbean sites that do a lot of place building work by sharing family images, family records that run parallel or even in some ways counter to the slave narratives. So not all of us are blessed to have pictures of our antecedents, but people are using pictures that have been posted to draw a reference of their own family's experience. And in that way, they're making the archive not only personal, but countering some of the grand narratives that we've had to encounter, particularly in the Caribbean around slavery, indentureship, place, belonging, that type of thing. So I think the slave narratives are important because they mark someone's interpretation and in instances, someone's lived experience. But then the slave narrative, along with the personal archive or our own archives, those two together give us, I think, a richer picture.
Both of your points bring to mind two things for me. One, in the work that Documenting the Now does, one of the central principles of the archiving, the idea of community-based archives that is emphasized there is thinking about the negotiation of access. Right. Like who is this archive created by? Who is it created for? And what sort of things do we want to use as points of access? Like who gets access to, if we did a decoding of what we mean, for instance, all the coded ways that we talk about people outside of our communities, if we did that and there was a code book, a code sheet, which God forbid, don't let anyone get any ideas. Let's not. But who would have access to that? And thinking about how that access might be negotiated over time, it links directly to earlier conversation about how we have to think about the images and the words and the messaging that activists put out into the sphere and how those things could be weaponized and used against them in the future. We often have to do some of that same sort of protective thinking about what we create right now and how we go about preserving it. If we don't want to see those things exploited specifically for profit, that's one of the comparison points that I see there. So not so much for criminalization, but for commercial profit, then how do we protect against that? The second point that comes up for me, I actually make reference to some work that Micah Broadnax and Jess Neal have done talking about digital legacy making. And that is to complement what Dr. Brunton has said, not everything is in a formal archive and not everything needs to be in a formal archive. There are so many personal archives that we are making and involved in each day, and that we are able to collectively build from things that have been put out on the web, but also from the things that we share in our intimate spaces in the personal communities that we have. Micah and Jess talk about this in terms of intentional centering of the individual and memories, experiences, and histories that are created in the digital space. So like thinking about how we go back, that service Time Hop reminds me of this, how Time Hop will bring you back to memories that you shared with other people. And they are very personal to you. They're not going to show up in any this day in history nationally, but they are significant to us. And so thinking about the archives, not only in a professional sense, but thinking about the archives in the personal sense as well. And so what sort of things do we want to keep really in our hearts and close to ourselves? We've got a question here for Dr. Brunton from Tara Conley. She asks, Dr. Brunton, you mentioned third space, and she says she perked up. It reminds her of Sylvia Wynter's work and the politics of representation, the genres of man. Can you talk more about how scholars can push ourselves to articulate and theorize Black joy that relies less on conventional Western or colonial theoretical perspectives around identity and technology?
Okay, the way that I've been doing it is to, one, think of the Americas from the United States all the way to Patagonia as a Creole space.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? We are, the people that inhabit the Americas are the first products of modern technology. We are, in fact, in a lot of instances, technology in and of ourselves. We were people that were made to exist in a space that was new.
Mm-hmm.
So I theorize it by thinking of the online space as an analog to the Americas for the age of discovery. And the way that we want to negotiate this space is by looking at the people who are inhabiting the space, not as Black people that are coming online, but that are people who are creating their Blackness online in a particular space. So the Blackness that you perform on Twitter, coming back to the third space in Black Twitter, is a Blackness for Black people.
Yep.
The Blackness that you perform in your everyday life, negotiating the world, is the world as you experience it. You know, so thinking about the third space as a Creole space where we're coming together, bringing our lived experiences to create something that is new, that gives us a sense of belonging in that space because of that space, I think has been the way that I've made sense of it.
I zone out for a second because if I want us to capture the significance of this, the third space as Creole space, especially with the performance of Black identity and Black identity making as a process of navigating through the world. That's huge, y'all. I'm very glad that this is being recorded because I'm coming back to it, I'm citing it, and you should too. I'm gonna put that endorsement in there. Man, gems. I wanna encourage folks again to use the Q&A feature to drop in questions, statements, reflections that you want us to consider in this time. There's another one here from Jacob Zaborowski. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Please forgive me and charge it to my head, not my heart, if I did not. Jacob says, when I was about a year plus into using Twitter, so this is early 2019, I remember seeing Shaun King's activism and financial dealings being scrutinized. As a white person encountering Black Twitter for the first time, I'd never really seen humor being used to bring the receipts and hold a public figure to account in quite that way. Could the panelists speak to specific examples of when they felt Black joy in the digital space shone a light on the powerful through humor that resonated with them?
So my immediate answer might be Paula Deen's recipes, but so I actually want to say something about what happens in those moments, for the audience here. One fairly refined kind of distinction that Black folks who are in these spaces understand is the difference between the roast and the drag.
Yep.
Right? Under the rules of Black Twitter, anybody can get it with a roast. Anybody can get clowned on any given day for any different thing. But when somebody gets dragged, there might be elements of the roast up in there, but this ends up being a moment where there's a collective sense that someone has stepped outside community norms and needs to be checked on that, right? And so it can be very playful, it can be vicious at times, it can be eviscerating, it can be all those at one time, and it can involve the receipts too. And so I'm offering that, for the kind of larger conversation, given how most of, well, let me hold off on that comment. I might come back to it later. But yeah, the difference between the roast and the drag is important. There have been days when King has been roasted, and then there have been days when he's been dragged.
Absolutely.
I'm going to leave Shaun King alone. And, I'm going to put my post-colonial hat on for a second here and use the day Jamaica stole Rihanna on Caribbean Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was a great pushback at the way the Caribbean is perceived. You know, people don't know the Caribbean. They don't know the separate individual Caribbean islands. They know Rihanna from the Caribbean. And Jamaica made the move, I want to say, at the end of 2019 on Twitter to steal Rihanna for a day. And that said everything that we needed to know. It spoke about what Adam spoke about, being dragged, or using pekong, which is the Caribbean expression, where people were just, the Jamaicans went all out on the Barbadians. And the Caribbean Twitter climbed onto American Twitter, pushing back on the way that the Caribbean was constructed. So I thought that was great.
Yeah. Ooh, oh, Steve Harvey gets roasted regularly.
Mine is probably going to be, and almost as quickly as I thought of it, it is gone. So maybe it'll come back to me in a second. But corollary to this, someone mentions in the chat, in addition to all the names that Black Twitter has given Sean King, someone asks about the processes of reading, dragging, and then of course they get to canceling. And so someone asked if canceling is something that comes after reading or dragging, or do Black people cancel folks? I'm gonna throw this to our panelists, and then I certainly have something to weigh in on with it.
So I want to offer two comments on that. First of all, so I would love to have, you know, some brilliant scholar, emerging scholar as a grad student or whoever, look at what we do with naming in our online lives, right? So in this moment, we're talking about Sean King and all of the names, you know, that are used to refer to him. What people do with their screen names, the signifying, the punning, the you know, the hyperbole, the references, and you can go back to Black Planet with that, of course. You can go back to Yahoo Chat. You can go back to nicknames when we were growing up, and the fact that you can't give yourself a nickname, you got to be given a nickname. Right. And so naming all the way through, and you can connect that to the literary if you want to, with what folks like Morrison do with naming. But we just need some real attention on that. Now, to your question about cancel, and I saw Makiba raise it. Here's what I'm going to say for this conversation. I think what has happened with the public notion of canceling and all of this hand-wringing about cancel culture is similar to what happened to woke. I think in the early days, and I have not tried to document this, so I'm not speaking as a scholar on this, but we had tongue-in-cheek ways that we were using cancel, just like we had tongue-in-cheek and self-aware ways we were using woke. You know, and that goes back to the joke, but I'm sleep though, circa 2012. And so what canceled and cancel culture became, when Black folk were using cancel on the early side of this, there was not the literal thing about this person is done with our lives forever. We want them fired. We want them, you know, no. And so I think the ironic uses and the playful uses got completely separated from what it's become. So.
Absolutely.
I think we say we don't F with you no more. And that can lead to the roasting and the dragging. But the literal canceling that the folk are out here worried about, nah.
I think Dr. Banks has wrapped it up nicely. I've got nothing to add, but I do have a provocation. People of a particular age would remember Roosevelt Franklin on Sesame Street.
Yeah.
Roosevelt Franklin did get canceled. And my question is, because I thought he was a perfect example of Black joy. I remember looking at him as a little boy and being absorbed by Roosevelt Franklin. And my question is, did respectability politics kill or cancel Roosevelt Franklin?
I'll offer a guess, Doc. I think the difference between what happened with the character in the strip and the corporate potential influences on what happened and how we saw it on television, I think the television version and reactions to the television version led to the scorn that we see for the Franklin character, where Schulz and the origin and whatever he was trying to do in the script were quite different.
Okay.
We've got another question on canceling and so-called cancel culture. Andrew Chalk asks, wasn't canceled stolen from Black culture coming from Your Love is Canceled? And in the chat, we've got, of course, the side conversation running. This is kind of like being at the movies with all of y'all. So we've got the narration that's going in the chat while the action's unfolding on the screen and people are talking to their neighbors. I put an article that I wrote about cancel culture in specific, not the analog antecedents, so boycotting, blacklisting, the sit-ins and protests, but making that distinction about how cancellation wasn't something that was just co-opted from Black communities, because there was this moment, you know, in Black digital culture where we were using the term about being canceled. And I saw it go by and it was my favorite example, Joanne the scammer in that GIF passing an espresso machine that was broken and saying, that's over, that's canceled, right? And so it being also a part of play and the way that our play comes into our accountability practice. And in these spaces, it's exercised as digital accountability practice. So we are having a good time, but we are also telling you that we don't mess with you no more. You're not down. Like, until you come correct, we're not fooling with you anymore. And I think one of the struggles in this, and one of the things that the right has done really well in co-opting narratives and repeating them and serving them up so that they do become a part of the news archive, which so significantly influences the archives that are created overall, is that they extract these terms separate of their meaning, separate of their significance in the community, and they rework the narrative to serve their purposes, which are ultimately to make us out to be deviant and aberrant figures, and to make our culture, there's no accident in the use of the term culture, right? When we think about the culture of poverty that's assigned to Black people, when we think about rap culture and hip hop culture that is supposed to be detrimental to US society, it's no accident that being canceled is now being called cancel culture and totally blown out of proportion and made into something that the everyday person should fear. This is very much one of those instances where, to go back to an earlier question about decoding, it's necessary for us to do some of that decoding work, to remind people that these terms have significant meaning, they have embedded meaning, they have a meaning that is very specific to a certain community or a certain set of communities. And they cannot be extricated from that. They cannot be separated and used in the same way, in the same sense. I don't see another question in the Q&A. I see the chat box just running like
I love it.
like the Chiron in news. It's just going over there. Amelia Gibson asks, is that decoding or is it contextualizing though? So when we talk about the different meanings and taking, and Amelia, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but taking meaning from one sense of a term and how it's used and applying it elsewhere. So are we doing the work of decoding or contextualizing when we do this explanation?
I would read it as decoding work, because I think if we take anything any bit of data randomly. It has a context. And I think that the decoding work is what you make of that expression in the context in which you find it. You know, it's one thing to say that, you know, saying something, putting something in context is saying Meredith said it, Adam said it. What Adam said or what Meredith said is subject to interpretation. That's personal. And I think that's decoding.
I won't disagree.
No, I thought that was really well put.
Coming back to, oh, actually, we do have another question, excuse me. What about Black digital seniors and joy? Vibert Cambridge. Vibert, and please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but tell us a little bit more about Black digital seniors and joy. So are we talking about Black elders in terms of physical lived age, or are we talking about those of us who have been on the web for a minute and are digital seniors? I am told I know what someone means, that those of us who are 30 and over.
The seasoned digital saints.
The grown and sexy, I like it. Indeed. So yeah, what about us Black seniors and joy? Or Black digital seniors and joy, excuse me.
Well, since Dr. Brunton already cited the Butter Pecan mixtape, the Uncle Twitter and Auntie Twitter threads, you know, are one space where we see evocations of joy with a playful nod to the elders. I'm also thinking about, I cannot think about the search terms for this video, so some of y'all have to help us here. But there's some event, it looks like it's basically about 6 sisters and a brother. They might be, you know, in the fellowship hall after church, but they're basically doing this little choreographed step. They're all in red and white, and the sister in the front is like just getting it in, and the elder brother deacon or whoever looks like he's doing enough that the sisters let him continue to, you know, do that step with him. I wish I could. I'm gonna have to find that video, but we get these videos from time to time, and across generation, one of the sites of joy, where the joy resides, is in our movement. So I've talked about the language play a lot, but in our physical movement. So whether it's the choreographed dances from Vine and now TikTok, you know, stuff that we find on Instagram, but even just how we hold our bodies and move in space. And so, you know, the elders have their share of those moments, no doubt.
I think one of the great things about being a Black digital senior or capturing joy as a Black digital senior is that you're capturing your life now after the mistakes. There was no social media back in the day. So, you know, I see it being made reference to quite a bit on the Caribbean Twitter. You know, thank God Twitter wasn't alive when I was a kid.
Yes.
And I think that's a great sense or a great source of senior Black joy online. You know, we can sit back and look at the mistakes happening in real time and go, thank goodness there's no timeline with me on it.
The mistakes, the awkwardnesses, the stuff we just didn't know and had to. So glad there is not that minute by minute, you know, kind of record we have to. Yeah, no doubt.
You know, 80s and 90s fashion, hairstyles.
The 90s color palettes, though, yeah, you know, those were cool.
I see that the question kind of got a little follow-up attention in the chat. So we are talking about something that is embedded with multiple meanings, right? When we talk about Black digital seniors. So there's Black digital seniors in the sense that those of us who have been on the web and really active on the web for such a time that we have now become elders in these spaces. And then there are Black digital seniors like a Dionne Warwick, for instance, as we reference our queen here in the chat. I saw a mention.
And whoever the team is.
Right. I saw a mention of Fine 50 Plus Twitter, the church ladies using TikTok to create different videos. Mr. Steal Your Grandma, thank you. So what is it, how about archiving those experiences, and what sort of care do we give to our elders, our physical elders, who have now come into this space, and they are able to have joy in ways that perhaps they did not experience it before? Like, it's one thing for a Black elder like a Dionne Warwick to have rapport with an audience on such a level. It's another for someone's, Summer mentions her 70-year-old aunt on IG. It's another for our Black seniors who have not had this sort of networked community to be able to collaborate and have fun in this space all together. What sort of attention should we be paying to our seniors as we think about archiving their moments of Black joy for the future?
May I ask an entirely playful question to make a semi-serious point in response to that?
Please.
All right. Computer Love dropped in '86, right? Zapp and Roger Troutman, right? So we at least 9-10 years before the GUI web, everything is dial up, it is text. And so in terms of maybe literal seniors and digital seniors, one place we should spend our attention is what the pre-GUI digital life was like for those Black folks who were there. I'll use a non-digital example. There's an episode of Good Times, Breaker Breaker, where social media was the CB in that moment. And it might be the first ever televised example of a catfish, where both JJ and Michael are faking the funk about who they are in order to try to attract someone, right? And so in that link from various kinds of radio technologies into the early folks who were coming online, I would love to see something documenting some of what they did, what they experienced, what they thought about it. Now I know that's going to be classed in particular ways because of who could afford computers at that time, right? But I think that's still a place worth looking.
I think there's
all right, Brock. We talking about your generation, fool.
I think there's a conversation to be had about affordances and choices of platforms for digital seniors, ease of use, why they're choosing these platforms. Who are they initially trying to reach? Is it their grandkids? Is it other church ladies, for example? I think there's a lot of work that can be done around that, because particularly in the Caribbean, and I haven't done a lot of work in the United States about this, the take up for technology with things as simple as ATM cards has been difficult. There are people there's a generation that still goes to the bank to have their bank book stamped and to withdraw money, but they're on TikTok. How does that make sense? I think there are huge conversations and quite a bit of research to be done. I think it needs to be centered around affordances and who are the communities that they're trying to reach out to in the first instance.
Rich with topics and frameworks and concepts for you to take and apply today in this discussion. We've got another question. We've got just a few minutes left, so this may be our last question before we wrap up. Dr. Tara Conley asked to our panelists, how are you conceptualizing the platform as representing Black cultural practices? What should we be thinking about the implications and consequences in terms of the role of platforms? So I'll read this once more again. How are you all conceptualizing the platform as representing Black cultural practices? what should we be thinking about in terms of the role of platforms?
I'll offer a start on it. I'm like Cedric the Entertainer, like I ain't got it, I can put some on it. But because ownership of media functions, looks in a whole different way, where for these digital platforms, these folks are invested in by venture capitalists. They've got, we know we're not getting those venture capital startup funds. We have to think about what happens with platform differently than we did in legacy media, right? Where ownership of, the organ was a huge point of emphasis. So we also know that these spaces are not going to stay with us for multiple reasons, including that they're not going to always suit our needs. So one thing we should be thinking about is Black digital migration. Mm-hmm. What happens when masses of folks go from one space to another, when they move to a different platform? What's the early community building like? Why did they go? When Black folks left my space would be a very different conversation than when other folks left my space, right? And so charting these movements of masses of us across the different spaces of our digital lives, I think that's an important area for study.
Black digital migration?
Yeah, I agree. And I also want to talk about Danny Miller. Andre Brock talked about it in the first panel yesterday. The way that Trinidadians made Facebook Trinidadian. Mm. What Danny Miller was unable to say was, again, coming back to the notion of the platform as the Creole space, where it is what you make of it. So, for example, in the Caribbean, in Trinidad in particular, Facebook continues to be the largest social media platform. Mm-hmm. But generationally, people are breaking off of Facebook using Twitter, using TikTok, et cetera, et cetera. But what's also interesting is that it's not necessarily a migration, but almost a diasporic growth across platforms. Mm-hmm. So, here I am on Facebook, but I'm also existing here on Twitter, and these two things are linked in a lot of ways, So if you follow someone across platforms, you see the same thing 5 times. Uh-huh. But I like to think of it as almost a diasporic migration across platforms or out into the broader world, So if you think of the communities as different communities, Facebook is structured more for intimates, family, friends that you've met along the way. Twitter is almost broadcasting. And then in the Caribbean, and I want to say outside of the United States, WhatsApp is a big thing.
Absolutely.
And I have come back to Trinidad and found myself in WhatsApp groups that have 500 people in them. Yeah. And there is a presence of, everyone is not leaving traces, but establishing almost buildings in each of these spaces. So I think of it as a diasporic migration across platforms.
All right, so we got Black digital migration and Black diasporic migration. I would think about this in terms of the platforms and the personal, like even the chat from today. When I go back to this concept of digital legacy making, I encourage us to think about how we are piecing together our own personal archives, our community archives, in a way that has meaning and significance and even safety for us. And looking at what we do, even the mundane. It's been mentioned in the chat about a dance show that was on public access. Even the mundane has significant meaning. And so when we think about archiving the Black web and archiving our experiences, or doing our best to, our experience of Black joy, I just want us to keep in mind our own ability to do digital legacy making. It's been an honor and a pleasure to share this panel with you, to share this time with you. We thank you all for your time.
Thanks to you as our moderator. Brilliant as always.
It was excellent.
Dr. Brunton, it's great being able to just interact with you off of Twitter.
It's been really, really nice to put, a voice in the face and thoughts and talk about something other than what it began. It's been wild.
I haven't even been the one bringing up the butter pecan for about the last year or so. They bring it to me.
So I want to thank you all for just a wonderful panel, and we certainly are wanting to stay in this atmosphere where the joy resides. And so thank you all for your thought and the joy that you brought today. Thank you to the attendees for keeping the chats fun and light, but also adding to the conversation. This makes me so proud that we actually have created a virtual space. How many Zooms we've been on where we are just like over it, but we have been able to create something that we envisioned and wanted. And now we are here where the joy resides. So I want to keep this conversation going in terms of cultivating joy. And so last night we had a Black Memory Worker Social. It was for us, by us. And so we are going to show you a snippet of that for about 40 minutes, where we are bigging up the folks that are doing really good work, archival work in the community around Blackness. And then after that, it will be followed by a live DJ set by our DJ, Lamar Harris, who's a music educator. You'll also hear about his project on the Show Out Showcase, because we're keeping it ratchet and real. So that's why it's called the Show Out Showcase. But anyhow, he's gonna start his set at about 2:55, but y'all stick around and enjoy this. And then next up, we have Kimberly Drew and the amazing Stacey Williams talking about Black Archives of the Future. So with that, I love y'all. And we going to where the joy resides. All right, bye.
I'm on mute. It's either please mute yourself or I'm on mute. I'm impressed, Burgess and McKee, but that was the first time today I think I was on mute. So again, thank you to an incredible shout out to McKee Burgess, John, our tech support, and to the team. This has been a phenomenal day. And again, a huge thank you to you all, and a super huge thank you to our incredible
What happened? Sorry.
shout out to your family, but again, a huge thank you to our panelists, presenters. We've had a wonderful day. So the Show Out Showcase, when McKee and I, my twin, we talked about, what a compliment. If people say I remind them of McKee, but that's one of the highlights of my life. So for our